One of the most important franchises in the GameCube and PlayStation 1 era is the Resident Evil franchise. Today I'm going to be taking a walk down history lane and playing the original Resident Evil. Now, the gameplay that you will see on screen is from the PS4 version. I don't actually own the original version, but the only main differences between the two are the voice acting changes and of course the graphical upgrades. Now, I've never actually played the original Resident Evil, and in fact this is the first Resident Evil that I have played and finished. So I don't really have any nostalgia for the original, so I can critique it as fairly as possible and see if it holds up in 2020, as much as this will be a retrospective on the original Resident Evil. Now, when people think of the original Resident Evil, most people think a scary atmosphere or the horror of seeing a zombie for the first time. But others go for the campy voice acting, and in this PS4 version, it hasn't changed that much. Although they did redo the voice lines, it still doesn't seem that the actors were taking it too seriously. And honestly, this does take away from the overall tone of the game, because the dialogue is still campy in some regards.
What is this place?
Not quite your ordinary house, that's for sure.
Hey, Whisker, where's Chris?
Jill, no! You don't want to go back out there.
It's almost hard to overlook when you're in the establishing intro cutscene, and also when you first enter the mansion. When you think Resident Evil, you think scary and shocking, but with this voice acting, it almost makes it seem like a parody of the horror genre in itself. And I get that the game is an expression of the time that it was created, but it's just something that I really can't overlook and can't ignore. The basic premise for the game is that a squad has gone missing and your crew is searching to find them. You become overwhelmed by a group of zombie dogs and you flee to a nearby mansion. You notice that one of your friends is missing, and that's where you search the mansion to find your friend, in lieu of the horrors that await. Now, you do get to choose your character. You can either play as Jill or Chris. Chris has more health and can take more hits from enemies, but Jill can't. Jill can take less hits, but she gets more help from other characters, whereas Chris doesn't, so you have to weigh the pros and cons when choosing which character you wish to play as. I personally chose Jill, but that's personal preference. The atmosphere of the game is truly tense and scary. Sounds are accentuated to add to the tension. For example, a clock's tick, but instead of ticking as a normal sound, it ticked with an ominous echo booming throughout the hall. Sound design like this really accentuates my experience. Even though there are no enemies in sight, just hearing that ticking of the clock keeps me on my toes. Even though I know I am safe, it does have an unsettling sound to it. The sound design in this game is so reputable. Even though there are a lack of enemies, especially in the earlier stages of the game, it always kept me on my toes, awaiting to see a zombie emerge from the hallway unbeknownst to me. And sound design like this is phenomenal in keeping the survival horror aspect of the game alive, especially before the franchise became more action heavy. And on the topic of survival horror, survival in this game is linked to your small inventory space. You will constantly have a lack of bullets, and you will have to choose when to use those bullets very wisely. They are certainly few and far between. Many times I had found myself to rely on my knife, which in combat isn't the best thing, and I usually just try and avoid combat in general, trying to run around an enemy rather than confront it, because zombies just aren't really worth the bullets. Now, Resident Evil in this form is not an action game. In fact, it's not only a survival game, but also a puzzle game. There have been numerous times where I've been confused about a puzzle, and specifically the key puzzle that you'll find quite early on in the game. I kept picking up the key and trying to escape somehow, but always kept dying. What I didn't know is that just a few rooms ahead, I'd find a replaceable key, a key that was identical to the key that was in the stand. So when I picked up the key, I could just place the duplicate key in the space, and therefore I wouldn't be killed by the spikes that could have caused my impending doom. Gameplay mechanics like this are rarely seen in modern games today. The only franchises that I could think would incorporate some form of mechanic like this would be the Tomb Raider and Uncharted franchise, but those games are most recently few and far between. Mechanics like this, for me, seem really refreshing, and I don't generally play a lot of games like Resident Evil, so it is honestly a nice change of pace to experience. On the topic of backtracking, you will be doing a heavy amount of it, in fact. Now, you will have heavy amounts of backtracking in semi-open worlds and Castlevania-esque games today, but those games, it seems to be quite taxing on the player, whereas in Resident Evil, it doesn't seem to persist to annoy the player. In the earlier sections of the game, you will have doors that have certain symbols on them with either a shield or a helmet or a sword, but later on you will find items to be able to open those doors and get valuable resources and just have a bigger area to explore. One thing that I really appreciate about Resident Evil is the fact that combat isn't vital to the core gameplay. In fact, you only really need to engage with enemies if you're in a really tight situation. If anything, I'd advise to avoid all combat in general. Gameplay mechanics like this really engage the player because not only have you got a limited inventory to use against these zombies, but you know that you could kill a zombie and then 2 meters down the hall there could be another one. So in scenarios where you feel like you're trapped, you've really got to weave your way in and out of these corridors to ensure that you not only don't waste bullets, but also don't waste your health. Saving the game will be few and far between. You only get a certain amount of ink ribbons, which you could compare to save tokens. These tokens allowing you to save the game, but later on down the line these become few and far between, and progressively you try and keep progressing through the game without saving more frequently, and this can either work in your favour and you do have more save points, or this can go horribly wrong and you get sent back either an hour or 2 hours back in your save progress. So you've really got to balance out how often you do save the game, but also how often you come across these save points. One thing that I feel like most people would complain about the game would be the tank controls, which were present in the original Resident Evil. Luckily for the PS4 version, you can choose to turn them off or try a modern version of the control system, or you can keep the traditional way of controlling your character. I personally chose the original controls because I wanted the original experience for the game, and it was hard. It was very difficult to learn how to control your character in a not so modern way. When you run into an enemy and you realise that you've got to turn around and get away because you either don't have any ammo or you don't really want to fight this enemy, then trying to turn your character around is slow and tedious, and as soon as that zombie gets so close to you, you are able to run away. The tank controls really add to the tension of your experience and almost make your character feel as clueless and scared as you are whilst playing the game. So the character accompanied by the tank controls almost becomes an extension of you in the Resident Evil world. Luckily for you and I, most of the zombies in this game are George Romero-esque zombies, and by that I mean that they are slow and can't really keep up with you at your walking speed, let alone your running speed. It's nice and easy to evade these zombies, but when they do catch you, it is utterly frustrating. Especially when you try and run past them by clinging to a wall, and then all of a sudden the zombie reaches out and grabs you and takes a massive chunk out of your health. But if these zombies weren't able to do that, then there would be no point in them being in this game in the first place, especially if you could just run past them without no intent of danger. The word cinematography is usually linked towards film and television, but Resident Evil honestly feels like a playable film. When going into a tight space, the camera angle will usually be off by a few degrees, or the camera will just be off-center in general. By doing this, it creates a scary and ominous feel to the game, almost like nothing is really right. When walking upstairs or going through a hallway, it really does feel like there's someone holding a camera right in front of you. The cinematography in this game is absolutely beautiful, and I'd say it's probably one of the best games with cinematography as prevalent as it is in the entire genre. Resident Evil is honestly one of the most stunning and aesthetically pleasing games that I have ever played, not only down to the cinematography or the tone of the entire game, but also the set dressing and how everything looks. Everything is so pristine, and yet has a serious, dark undertone to it. Resident Evil has proven to be a very successful franchise that has spanned multiple generations of gaming consoles, and I'm pretty sure it will do for many more gaming generations to come, especially because most recently we have been having Resident Evil 2 remakes, Resident Evil 3 remake, and soon to be a leaked Resident Evil 4 remake. Resident Evil 1 is an icon in gaming, and I feel like if you love cinematography in games and sound design, then I'd truly say that Resident Evil is highly recommendable in 2020. And obviously you can choose to play however you like. If you want to go for the original gameplay style with the tank controls, you can do that. If you don't, you don't have to. But I'd highly recommend this game in 2020, not only because of those cinematography and sound design aspects to the game, but also because of the tone and the survival horror aspects in itself that made Resident Evil what it is today. And so that was my retrospective on Resident Evil 1 in 2020. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy, then subscribe and turn on that notification button so you don't miss another upload from me. So thank you and goodbye.